Hebrews chapter 11, starting at verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
All right, thanks, Wendell. All right, big crowd today. That's good. This is good. We've been going through the so-called Heroes of the Faith or Hall of Faith passages. Last week we were supposed to cover Noah, but Doug, things changed, and Doug's brother Ed ended up preaching a great sermon on John 3:16. So we're not going to do Noah today, as you can see. So we're skipping around, but we'll mention Noah just for all you completionists out there. But this is one of the longer portions of this passage. As Wendell knows, he had to read 9 verses, something like that. I titled the sermons Abraham and Sarah the Hard Way because if a nation is going to come from one man and woman, they did it the hard way. Sarah was very old when she had their son, Isaac, and Abraham was old when he went to live in the land that was promised to him that he would never get to own. He didn't, it wasn't his. He was a foreigner there, even though God had given it to him. And we'll see kind of why, just how hard that was. I'm just going to move this a little bit. All right, you can go to the next slide. So this is a random kid. You're probably wondering who this is. Charles Johann Moritz Hammerland. His name, if you can read that little writings, is Carl. That's what he was called in as a kid. So if you're wondering what's so special about this kid, he grows up to be a house painter. Oh, no one's impressed? Okay, yeah. He became a regular house painter. So why is he up here? Okay. That's my great-grandfather. He was called Carl in Sweden before he changed his name later. But he had probably, and I don't know, I don't have all the information because I did not ask questions to my grandmother while she was alive. But I do know some things, and the reason I'm telling you the story of a boy who became a house painter, and this will be his story of how he became a house painter, is actually pretty interesting. So he was, I don't know how old he is in this picture, but he's a kid still. When he was 12 years old, him and his brother, I think they had been abused by his mother, possibly. Anyways, they lived in Sweden, Stockholm, Sweden. And if you can go to the next slide, there you go, on top of it. That's Sweden, 1900. He was born in 1888. And by the time he was 12 years old, that's what Sweden looked like, at least the part he was from. He and his brother Oscar had secretly stashed piles of clothes and stockpiled clothes, and there was a British freighter carrying coal to Sweden, and they snuck on board the lifeboats. And this is 10, and his brother was 13. They were very young. They snuck on board a lifeboat and possibly one of those ships, who knows? And they hit out. Finally, they were out to sea, and they were starving. They were just, they couldn't take it anymore, so they got out and they revealed themselves. And, they could have been thrown overboard, who knows? But the captain was kind enough to make them work and let them eat. And, you can imagine it wasn't a Carnival cruise. It was, they had to work. The conditions were bad. They had to, do all the same work as the adults did, and they had to eat last, and they, it was not easy. They didn't treat kids with kid gloves, so to speak. So he spent his entire teenage years sailing around the world. They ended up just becoming sailors. Their entire teenage years. No high school, no middle school, nothing like that. Just sailing on a boat, doing sailor work. He got to see the whole world. So if you can go to the next slide, that's him when he's a little bit older. That's Brooklyn, New York, 1908. And the reason I have a picture of Brooklyn, New York in 1908 was because in 1908, that young man and his brother jumped ship when they got to New York. They didn't exactly sign the right papers. So they made it to New York, and they were, the stories are he's like stealing food from like the food vendors and running away, and crazy stuff. He ends up moving, because he's Swedish, to, does anyone know where he would have moved to? Minnesota. Yes, of course. Everyone knows. If you know, you know. All the Swedish people went to Minnesota. So you can go to the next slide, and that's the lady he married, Alice Engström. They started a family in Minnesota. He was a house painter, regular house painter, but his story, and the reason I'm kind of telling the story is because you wouldn't think the story of a boy becoming a house painter is epic, but it's pretty epic. It was pretty big. And that's a story each one of us, if we're living in the United States right now, there's some immigration story we all have, right? There's some monumental thing brought us here. And it's kind of the fabric of our story, and we love to hear those stories if we know them. We don't all know all the stories because we don't know all our family histories as well as we wish, probably. But he was, this story is like so many, and it's something that I can look back on and think, wow, this is when you really think about it, like, how scared do you have to be? How bad do things have to be for you to leave at that young age and face really a lot of discomfort? That's not an easy life. And he came here and just all that to become a regular house painter. But I know there's people here who have those same stories. They're just doing regular jobs, but to get here, they had these epic stories. Now, what he did have that, and where I'm telling this story because it connects to Abraham's immigration story, he did have like a place to live. He had a house, had a family that was stable. And we'll see that Abraham didn't even have some of those things. All right, so you can go to the next slide. Yeah, that's just the Tower of Babel. That's exactly what it looked like. No differences. That's historically it. Yeah. We're gonna talk about the Tower of Babel in a second, but first I'm just gonna kind of give you an overview of what we're gonna do. We're gonna go into Abraham's story of leaving his homeland to come to the land of Canaan, which was the land God told him to go to. We're gonna also talk about Sarah. Now, one brief, I didn't have as much time to prepare as normal, so usually I look at different translations. The NIV translated that you heard Wendell reading said that it was by faith Abraham became a father. That's the NIV translation. I am looking at the ESV, and it has by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive when she was past the age. So a little slight difference. I'm going with the ESV and other translations that it was by faith Sarah received the power to conceive. Just know it could different interpretations of that. But we're gonna look at both their stories, and then we're gonna plug those back into that passage in Hebrews. And I think we'll find why the author of Hebrews is using those stories in particular. All right, so Tower of Babel. Who knows that story? Heard of it? Yeah, a few. Yeah, my dad better raise his hand. He was a pastor. It's like the Tower of Babel. Let me look it up. Google.com. It's a little unfortunate actually, because this one, you hear this one growing up as a kid so often that you kind of you think you know it and you just flies by. It's really an important story in the book of Genesis and really in the whole Bible. And it's early Jewish literature also plugs Abraham into the story of the Tower of Babel. But we will see where it is in the Bible is in Genesis 11. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. And that follows like a really boring part of the Bible that we call the Table of Nations. It's in Genesis 10. And I'm not going to read that because it's just a bunch of list of names and people and where all the countries in the world come from and all that stuff. At least in the countries they knew at that time. But God had told Noah after, and this is also after Noah. So here we are talking about Noah now. For all of you who missed last week, not having Noah, it was bugging you. I know it. Now you get to hear about Noah. So God, in chapter 8 of Genesis, God says to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So that last part, be fruitful and multiply on the earth, that's the part that that was the idea. God wanted humans. One of the reasons we're here is to take care of creation. That was our job. Remember, God gave man dominion over the earth. We're not supposed to all be together, especially at this time. We were supposed to go out and do that job. And one of the things God didn't like about the Tower of Babel was that people were coming together as one, and they were building. It was probably a lot of scholars think it was more like a ziggurat, if you know what that is. Kind of almost like a pyramid, but it's a larger base, and they build a smaller base on top, and you can get higher and higher. And one of the reasons they did that because the gods lived in the sky, and they wanted to get closer to God. And that was just offensive to God on so many levels. And so he eventually, of course, if you know the story, he confuses the languages of everyone, and they're forced to now do his will and go out and multiply around the earth. That comes right after we meet, right before we meet Abraham. So that's kind of the background where he's coming from. God is moving people, forcefully moving people, so they have to go out through all the earth. And now Abraham kind of falls into that. So let's see where. Okay, yeah, you can go to the next slide. All right, this is a real place, the Ziggurat of Ur. And the reason it's up there is because it's in Iraq, modern day Iraq right now. The reason it's up there is because that's where Abraham possibly was from. So I say possibly because we never know anything for sure when it comes to that old history. But if we go back to the Genesis 11:27 through 32, and I think it's up there. Now these are the generations of Terah. So Terah is coming out of this Table of Nations, and actually out of the Babylon story, the Tower of Babel story. And the Tower of Babel was the idea was it's in with the Babylonians, the ancient Babylonians. So that part of the world. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, and the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. And that is going to come into play later, as we'll see. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Okay, so you can go to the next slide, I think. You'll see a red line with an arrow at the top, and you'll see this kind of orange line way down there. The reason there are two lines is because scholars disagree about where Ur was or where Abram was. That's the north view up there. That it was up there. Probably more likely it was down there. That's where actual Ur is. That's where you'll find that ziggurat. So you can see he traveled a long ways, and again, this is where Tower of Babel was, and God is spreading people around the land. So Abraham's probably part of that dispersion, or possibly. So they go to Haran. Now you can go to the next slide. Haran also, it's not the same. In Hebrew, it's spelled differently than his brother Haran. That's Haran, Turkey. It's in Turkey right now, the southern part of Turkey. It's one of the oldest cities in the world, and as you can see, it's lively and bustling with activity. That's the most crowded scene I found. That's from Google Maps. That was the most crowded it got. But you can see there's like ancient ruins right there and random piles of dirt. I'm worried about that motorcycle guy. It looks like he's trying to jump off. I don't know. Like, turn. Hopefully he's fine. Eyes on the road next time, bud. So this is Haran. Haran is one of the oldest cities in the world. It's still around today. You can still go there. And if you go to the next slide, you can see things like this. This is an old building. It's about as old as this church, which is not that old. But these are what the houses used to look like. They call them beehive houses. They're made with like mud brick and stuff. And you can go there, and that's one of the tourist attractions there. But that's kind of gives you a glimpse of what maybe it looked like back in Abraham's time or maybe later. And then you can go to the next slide. And this is just some more ruins in Haran. It was, you could kind of see why he left, kind of a dump. Actually, at that time, you have to use your imagination. This was a bustling city. This was right by a river, a big river. It's there's a lot of trade going back and forth. And this is where Terah takes his family, and this is it's located on a road that ran from Nineveh to Carchemish. It was a very important city, regarded as important by the Assyrian kings. Assyria was a big empire back in the olden times. But God had something else for Abram. And why did he move him from this amazing city to the land of Canaan, where he had nothing? So think about this. Where he is right now is he's in a very, very important city. He's rich. He's rich. We know that because when it says he ends up leaving, he has people. He's accumulated possessions and people, and he's got a lot of stuff. He's wealthy. He's doing well. But God says this. God says this is in chapter 12, 1 through 9. I'll just read it. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Not a good age to make a new start somewhere where you don't know anyone. But there he goes. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. And you can advance the slide, I think. Yeah, so this is that same slide. So he's going down. We're going down to Shechem is right there. It's above Jerusalem, kind of. If you look at the compass rose, it's just to the right of that little dot where the yellow arrow ends. That's Shechem. And if you go to the next slide, and there we go. That's Shechem now. It's called Tel Balata today in the West Bank, but that was where he settled. Not in one of those buildings, but probably in a tent somewhere. By the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going towards the Negev, which is towards the bottom of Israel. So, God is moving Abraham. He moves them to the land of Canaan. So let me just reread that passage in Hebrews, just that section where we're talking about Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So he's promised this land, but he doesn't get to build in this land. He doesn't get to build a city for himself in this land. He doesn't get to build a city for his kids in this land. His kids don't get to build a city. His grandkids don't get to build a city. He's looking forward to something down the road. He's looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. All right, now let's look at Sarah. So it says in Hebrews, it says, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. And then we can advance one more slide. Now this is part of her story. So before I read this, Abraham had received a visit from some men who turned out to be more than men, angels, and one of them is actually God. And they tell him what they're going to do. They're there actually to see Sodom and Gomorrah, to see if they're as bad as people have been saying, because they were not great examples of hospitality there. But here's what they say. They said to him in verse 9, they said to him, this is Genesis 18, where is Sarah your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. In other words, she's not having kids. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. And that's interesting. That's we're gonna talk a little bit more about that laughing, but she's gonna remember that. She's gonna remember that. Now in the next passage, you can go to the next slide. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And the name of Isaac means laughter. So she's internalized that whole process. A whole year goes by, and she's believed what God had told her. And now instead of laughter as more of a scoffing kind of like, that's ridiculous laughter, it's joy. There's joy in that laughter. So the question is like, well, where did the faith part come in for Sarah? And let's just dive into a little bit of what it was like to be a woman at that time. So you can go to the next slide. So womanhood in the ancient Near East, this will not be exhaustive, but we'll kind of see like what barriers they're facing. So you can go to the next one. First of all, barrenness was considered a curse. If you were barren, it must be because you did something bad or God's not happy with you, or one of the gods, because not everyone, believed in Yahweh. They had many gods. If you're barren, that meant something bad. It was not good. You can go to the next one. Childbirth was often fatal. I mean, it's still fatal today. You can die from childbirth. It's a lot less common, but it can still happen. It was dangerous. But childbirth was also the most valued part of being a woman. Childbirth, I'm sorry. because only women can do that. And that's how, and because the infant mortality rate was so high, you'd have many kids, but you probably wouldn't keep, not many would survive into adulthood. So you had, that was one of the most valuable thing at that time that a woman could provide was children. So this is another thing about women that maybe it's a little harder to see, is that it's not recorded at the same degree as men, but women did have robust spiritual lives, and they had a lot of influence on the family unit. And just to mention a few points, Proverbs 31, you have a mother giving spiritual and practical advice to her son. It's very well-known chapter in the Bible. Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2, a lot of deep theology in there. She was obviously not just, not paying attention. She was very involved with her spiritual life, and she dedicated her son Samuel to God, and physically, here he is. He grew up around the tabernacle with Eli, and you had the other side of that coin is foreign women caused the Israelites to worship false gods. They had a lot of influence that way, so it could be for good or for bad. One example is when the Israelites were in the camp. This is in Numbers 25. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So these other cultures, these women would influence the men in Israel to follow false gods. They held enormous influence. Solomon's wives turned his heart away. It says he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. All and his wives turned away his heart. So women did have a lot of influence in the spiritual walk in their faith, in the family. It wasn't just following the patriarchs. So I think you can go to the next slide. I don't remember what's on the next. No, go back one. We'll park here for just a minute. So Sarah had everything stacked against her. Remember, she was cursed. She was barren. She didn't have any kids, which in Abraham stuck with her, which is commendable. That was good. But she had no kids. So she's, and then a double whammy. If she did have kids at that age, in her late 90s, that's not a good, I don't like the chances of surviving that. That's not easy. But she was also a participant in faith with Abraham. Together they trusted God. They believed God's promise. When there's no reason to believe God's promise. Because what had Abraham got? He moved to a place where he couldn't build a house. He had to live in tents. He had no prospects for his kids to build a house. There was nothing for him there at that time. But they believed. They had faith. It says in, just to reread that section in Hebrews, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They didn't see the results of their faith. Now you can go to the next slide, and this is where I want to put it back into context. That is in Rome, the city, in Italy. That's the Arch of Titus. They would build these arches when someone great had done something great. They loved giving themselves parades. And they would build these. They call them triumphs, where they would go into the city and everyone fawn all over them. So Titus became emperor eventually. He was the one who, if you've heard of the Roman Colosseum, he was the one who was the first emperor when that was opened up. It was built under his predecessor and finished under him. But you can't really see it really well, but if you look right under there, there's a little relief of, you can see a menorah there. He was the one who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and he was the one who took over from Vespasian during the siege of Jerusalem. So he's kind of the guy responsible for wiping it out. And remember, this is, I mentioned a couple Sundays ago, this was probably written around 68 AD, which was just a couple years before the temple was destroyed, maybe even later. If you're a Hebrew at this time, this is a scary time. And God is going to be asking you to do some stuff that doesn't make sense because it's scary. And we, going back to that story of my great-grandfather, moving someplace, who knows where you don't know anyone, is scary. And we all have those stories. We all have those stories in our family histories. If you're here, we have those stories. We know these stories. It's just sometimes hard to kind of live in that fear, what that fear must have been like, unless you've done it yourself and you know exactly what it's like. So I want to read something just in closing about towards the end of Hebrews. This is Hebrews 13, 7 through 16. It says this: "Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods which have not benefited those devoted to them. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. He is crucified outside the city. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come." And think about that in light of people who know they're about to lose Jerusalem, where the temple is. Here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good, but share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. We don't know what's coming next for us. We don't know the next thing that's going to happen to us. We don't know where God's going to take us next. We could be old and still have a lot more to do, like Abraham. We could be young and scared. We could be in terrible conditions that we feel like we need to flee from. We need to get out of here. Or we could, there's just so many different times in our lives where what God's asking us to do does not make sense. And it's not a promise, by the way, following God is not a promise that your life will be better materially. None of these guys, we'll read this whole Hall of Faith thing, for almost all of them, it was either they went through a trauma, even Noah, imagine seeing everyone die, like all the destruction after that flood. Remember in Mesopotamia, like all those houses, all those buildings were mud brick. What happens after a flood? nothing. It's all gone, all gone. And if you've ever seen pictures of a tornado or something after it's wiped out a town, it's horrifying. This is, that's a trauma. There's none of these people made out like bandits. You know, they didn't end up smelling like roses. Some of them, it was they either went through a trauma or their lives ended badly. We'll see later, like prophets, people who were following God very closely, sawn in half, killed for following God. But even when we're faced with a trauma like a complete upheaval of your life, we can look back to these men and women who held on to God and they held on to their faith, not because it gave them something that they ever saw in their lifetime, but because they put their faith in a city that was yet to be built, that was being built by God himself, not by man. Dear Lord, thank you for just bringing us all together today, Lord. I just pray you would watch over those who aren't with us, Lord, that you would protect them if they're traveling. And we just dedicate our lives to you, Lord, our decisions. I pray that when we are faced with really hard things, Lord, with really hard decisions, difficult circumstances, Lord, that we would lean on you and not on ourselves, Lord. We love you and praise you, and just pray for that kind of faith, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.